I'm a 28-year-old woman with a steady job, a decent savings account, and a family dynamic that's well complicated. My younger sister Mia, 25, has always been the golden child. If you've ever met someone who could fall into a pile of trash and come out smelling like roses, that's Mia. She has this way of making everyone around her feel like she's the most important person in the room. And somehow, she gets away with it every time. Growing up, I was the responsible one. Good grades, part-time jobs, and trying to keep the peace when Mia inevitably stirred up drama. My parents, Grace 55 and Robert 58, didn't help. They adore Mia. Not in a blatant way that anyone outside the family would notice, but in the little things like how Mia's mistakes are brushed off while mine are analyzed under a microscope. My grandparents were my saving grace. They lived just a few miles away in the family home, a charming old place with creaky floors and a garden that always smelled like lavender. I spent countless weekends there, helping my grandma bake or listening to my grandpa's stories about simpler times. They were my escape. They didn't play favorites or hold grudges. They loved us equally, but I always felt like they saw me for who I was, not who they wanted me to be. When they passed away a few months ago, it was like losing the only anchors I had. They'd always been so vibrant, so full of life. Their deaths hit me hard, but I found comfort in the fact that they'd made their wishes clear. They'd promised me the house, the place where I felt most at home, and a portion of their estate. It wasn't about the money for me, it was about the memories and the connection I had with them. The funeral was when things started to feel off. Mia showed up late, wearing a designer dress that screamed, "Look at me." She worked the room like it was a networking event, smiling and laughing like we weren't there to mourn. My parents, of course, hung on her every word, as if she was the only one keeping the family afloat. I tried not to let it bother me. After all, we were there for Grandma and Grandpa, not to hash out old grievances. A few weeks later, I got a call from the family lawyer about the will. I was expecting it to be straightforward. After all, my grandparents had been very clear about their intentions. But when the lawyer started going over the details, my name wasn't mentioned at all. Not for the house, not for the inheritance, nothing. I was stunned. I knew there had to be a mistake. My grandparents wouldn't have just cut me out like that. I asked the lawyer if he was sure, and he said the will had been updated recently, just a few weeks before their deaths. Mia was named the primary beneficiary. She got everything, the house, the money, all of it. When I called Mia to ask about it, she acted surprised. She said she had no idea the will had been changed and suggested that maybe our grandparents had a change of heart. She even threw in a line about how they probably thought I didn't need the money as much since I had a steady job. Something about the whole thing felt off. My grandparents were meticulous people. They wouldn't have made such a major change without talking to me. And the timing, so close to their deaths, seemed suspicious. I started going through old messages and emails from them, looking for any clues. That's when I found it, a scanned copy of an earlier version of the will. It was exactly what I'd expected, with me named as the primary beneficiary of the house and a significant portion of the estate. I confronted Mia with the copy, but she brushed it off, saying it was probably outdated and not legally binding. She accused me of being ungrateful and causing drama. My parents predictably sided with her. They told me to let it go, saying that what's done is done and that fighting over the will would only tear the family apart. But I couldn't let it go. My grandparents trusted me. They'd made their wishes clear, and I wasn't about to let Mia rewrite history. I started digging deeper, looking into the timeline of when the will was supposedly updated. I reached out to the lawyer again, asking for details about the changes. At first, he was hesitant, but eventually he admitted that Mia had been the one to push for the updates. She'd been in constant contact with the office in the weeks leading up to my grandparents' deaths. It wasn't just that she'd gotten the inheritance. It was how she'd done it, sneaking behind my back, manipulating our grandparents in their final days, and then pretending to be innocent. I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, staring into the chaos Mia had created. My parents believed her. Most of the extended family believed her. But I knew the truth, and I wasn't about to let her get away with it. That's when I decided to fight back. If Mia wanted to play dirty, I'd make sure the truth came out, no matter what it took. I reached out to the family lawyer again after finding the old version of the will. This time, I wasn't going to let him brush me off. I asked him to explain how my name had been completely erased from the inheritance, despite my grandparents' clear intentions. After some hesitation, he admitted that Mia had been very involved in the process leading up to the changes. She'd visited the office several times, claiming to help our grandparents with the paperwork. The new will had been finalized just a month before their deaths. That timing was suspicious, especially since my grandparents hadn't mentioned anything to me during that time. I asked the lawyer if he had any evidence of Mia's involvement. At first, he was reluctant, citing confidentiality. But after some pressing, he shared that there were text messages and meeting logs that indicated Mia had been heavily pushing for the changes. Armed with this new information, I confronted Mia. She acted shocked, like she couldn't believe I'd think she was capable of manipulating the will. She insisted our grandparents had changed their minds and accused me of being greedy. When I tried to reason with my parents, they told me to stop causing drama. They didn't want to believe that Mia could have done something so deceitful. As if that wasn't enough, Mia started spreading her own version of events to the rest of the family. She painted me as ungrateful and obsessed with the inheritance. At family gatherings, I noticed how cousins and aunts who used to chat with me now avoided eye contact. It felt like I was being slowly pushed out of the family circle. Even people I hadn't spoken to in years were messaging me, asking why I was stirring up trouble. Meanwhile, I continued piecing things together. I went through my old text messages with my grandparents and found several where they clearly stated their plans for the house and inheritance. They talked about how much the house meant to me and how they knew I'd take care of it. I saved everything I could find, building a timeline to prove what they'd told me and when. I decided to take legal action. I contacted a lawyer specializing in contested wills and explained everything. She agreed to take my case, and we filed a claim to contest the will. Once the papers were served, Mia's reaction was immediate. She called me, furious, claiming I was ruining her life. My parents begged me to drop the case, saying it would tear the family apart, but I wasn't backing down. At the initial hearing, Mia's demeanor was telling. She was jittery, avoiding eye contact with the judge and fumbling through her responses. My lawyer presented the original version of the will as evidence, along with the texts and meeting logs from the family lawyer showing Mia's interference. While this wasn't enough to prove outright fraud, it raised enough questions to warrant further investigation. As the case progressed, more details about Mia's behavior came to light. One of the biggest shocks was learning she'd already used part of the inheritance to buy herself a brand new luxury car. It was flashy, bright red, and completely out of place for someone who claimed to have no involvement in securing the will. When I asked her about it, she shrugged it off, saying she'd always wanted one and saw no harm in treating herself. The arrogance of it all only fueled my determination. My grandparents had trusted me, and I wasn't going to let Mia's schemes tarnish their memory. With each new piece of evidence, my case grew stronger, but so did the divide in the family. Grace and Robert continued to defend Mia, insisting there had to be a misunderstanding. They didn't want to hear about the mounting evidence. Mia kept up her act, playing the victim and accusing me of dragging the family's name through the mud. But I could see the cracks starting to form. At one point, my lawyer uncovered discrepancies in the timeline of the will's updates. The dates didn't align with my grandparents' known health issues, suggesting that they might not have been in the best state of mind when the changes were made. This added another layer of doubt to Mia's story. As more family members learned about the legal case, some began to question Mia's actions. A few reached out to me privately, offering support and sharing their own doubts. One distant cousin even provided me with old voice recordings where my grandparents talked about their plans for the house. It was bittersweet listening to their voices again, but it reminded me why I was fighting so hard. With the trial date looming, tensions were at an all-time high. Mia tried to bribe me into settling, offering to give me a small portion of the inheritance if I dropped the case. I refused. This wasn't just about the money, it was about doing right by my grandparents and holding Mia accountable. Every day, I felt more confident that the truth would come out. The evidence was piling up, and Mia's behavior was becoming harder to defend. She'd underestimated me, thinking I'd back down when the pressure got too intense. But I wasn't the same person I was when we were kids. This time, I wasn't going to let her win. My lawyer suggested bringing in a forensic expert to examine the will. If there was foul play, we needed concrete proof. The expert meticulously analyzed the document, comparing the signatures on the revised will to verified examples from my grandparents' past records. After a thorough review, the findings were clear the signatures had been forged. This discovery changed everything. Armed with this evidence, my lawyer filed an official motion to include the forgery report in the case. As whispers about the forgery began to spread among the family, my parents couldn't ignore the situation any longer. Grace and Robert, who had staunchly defended Mia up until now, started asking questions. The cracks in their loyalty to her became more visible. At the same time, a distant cousin I hadn't spoken to in years reached out. They'd heard about the case and offered to help. This cousin had spent a lot of time with my grandparents in their later years and confirmed they'd always intended for me to inherit the house. They even had voice recordings of conversations where my grandparents openly discussed their plans to leave me the house and part of the estate. Those recordings were a powerful addition to my growing collection of evidence. Mia's response to all of this was to go on the offensive. She started accusing me of dragging the family name through the mud and being money hungry. She complained to anyone who would listen, spinning the narrative that I was the one causing problems. Grace pleaded with me to drop the case, claiming it was tearing the family apart. She didn't want to believe her golden child could do something so underhanded, but even she couldn't ignore the growing pile of evidence. Robert, on the other hand, seemed to be quietly reevaluating his stance. During one particularly tense conversation, he admitted he wasn't sure Mia was entirely innocent. My lawyer continued building our case. We now had the forged will, the original version of the will, and voice recordings from my grandparents. It was becoming increasingly difficult for Mia to maintain her facade of innocence. Still, she wasn't ready to back down. In fact, she doubled down on her tactics. One day, I discovered something shocking. Mia had forged checks from my grandparents' account, shortly before their deaths. These weren't small amounts, either. She'd been siphoning money for months under the guise of helping with their expenses. My lawyer quickly added this to the growing case file. The more we uncovered, the clearer it became that Mia had been systematically taking advantage of my grandparents during their most vulnerable time. When Grace and Robert learned about the forged checks, they finally confronted Mia in private. At first, she tried to deny everything, but when pressed, she shifted tactics. She argued that she deserved the inheritance more than I did, because she'd been there for them during their final months. That argument didn't hold much weight, especially considering the mounting evidence against her. As the trial date approached, the tension in the family reached an all-time high. Extended family members started choosing sides, and the divide grew deeper. Some relatives openly supported me, while others clung to the idea that Mia couldn't possibly be guilty. It was exhausting, but I knew the truth was on my side, and I wasn't going to let her win. Mia tried one last desperate move to avoid the courtroom showdown. She called me late one night and offered a deal. If I dropped the case, she'd give me a portion of the inheritance, enough to make the fight not worth it. I refused. This wasn't just about money. It was about standing up for what was right and honoring my grandparents' wishes. Meanwhile, my lawyer continued preparing for the trial. The forensic expert would testify about the forged signatures, and the recordings from my cousin would be played in court. The evidence of the forged checks would also be presented, painting a clear picture of Mia's manipulation. Grace and Robert, now fully aware of the extent of Mia's deceit, stopped defending her publicly. They didn't apologize outright, but their silence spoke volumes. Mia, however, wasn't ready to admit defeat. She kept spinning her narrative, insisting she was the victim in all of this. The trial was only days away, and I felt ready. The truth was finally coming to light, and for the first time I felt like justice might actually prevail. The family relationships, however, were irreparably strained. Grace and Robert avoided direct conversations with me, clearly embarrassed by how far they'd gone to defend Mia. Extended family members were split, with some reaching out to show support and others staying firmly in Mia's camp. Despite the chaos, I stayed focused. The fight wasn't just for the inheritance, it was for my grandparents, who had trusted me to do the right thing. As the trial date approached, I could see Mia's confidence wavering. For the first time, she seemed to realize that she might not come out on top. The stage was set for the courtroom showdown, and I was ready to face whatever came next. The courtroom was packed on the first day of the hearing. I could feel the weight of every stare as I walked in, but I stayed focused. My lawyer opened with the forensic evidence, presenting the expert's analysis of the will. The expert explained, in clear terms, how the signatures on the revised document didn't match my grandparents' authentic ones. Charts and overlays showed the discrepancies, making it impossible to deny the forgery. Mia's lawyer tried to argue that the changes were legitimate, and that my grandparents might have signed differently due to age or illness. But the expert was ready for that, pointing out that even with shaky hands, certain unique traits of their signatures wouldn't have changed. The judge seemed to pay close attention to this, nodding along as the expert spoke. Next, my lawyer called me to the stand. I shared details about my relationship with my grandparents, the weekend spent baking with my grandma, helping my grandpa with his garden, and listening to their stories about the house. I described how much the house meant to them and their clear intention to leave it to someone who would care for it. The courtroom was quiet as I spoke, and I could see some people in the audience wiping their eyes. Then it was Mia's turn. Under cross-examination, her confidence started to crumble. She'd rehearsed her answers, but as my lawyer pressed her on the timeline of events, she stumbled. At one point, she claimed she hadn't been involved in the will's changes, only to contradict herself moments later by admitting she'd helped facilitate the updates. The inconsistencies were glaring. My lawyer pointed out how her stories didn't match the evidence we'd presented, texts with the family lawyer, meeting logs, and of course the forged signatures. Mia tried to redirect blame, saying she was only following what she thought were my grandparents' wishes. But the more she spoke, the more her lies unraveled. Grace and Robert were called to the stand next. Watching them testify was a mix of awkwardness and vindication. Grace, who had been Mia's staunchest defender, looked visibly uncomfortable. She admitted she'd assumed Mia was innocent but hadn't known about the forged checks or the extent of Mia's involvement in the will's changes. Robert, though more subdued, admitted he'd started to doubt Mia's version of events as more evidence came to light. Their testimonies were neutral overall but hinted at their growing unease with Mia's behavior. The recordings from my cousin were the next bombshell. Hearing my grandparents' voices in court was both heartbreaking and empowering. They talked about how much the house meant to them and their plans to leave it to me, mentioning my dedication and the time I'd spent with them. The judge listened carefully, occasionally glancing at Mia, who sat stiffly in her chair. When the forged checks came up, Mia's composure finally broke. My lawyer presented bank records showing how money had been siphoned from my grandparents' accounts and used for personal expenses, including the luxury car Mia had purchased. When questioned directly by the judge, Mia struggled to provide a coherent explanation. She mumbled something about helping with bills but couldn't justify the amounts or the purchases. Mia's frustration boiled over. She lashed out, claiming I was ruining her life and accusing me of being greedy. Her outburst didn't help her case. If anything, it reinforced the image of someone willing to manipulate and deceive to get what she wanted. After days of testimony and evidence, the judge finally delivered the verdict. The original will was reinstated, granting me the house and the portion of the estate my grandparents had intended. Mia was ordered to return the misused funds, including the money she'd spent on her car. Watching her reaction as the ruling was read was surreal. For the first time, she seemed to grasp the consequences of her actions. Grace and Robert approached me after the hearing. For the first time in years, they apologized. They admitted they'd been wrong to blindly trust Mia and expressed regret for not believing me sooner. While their apology didn't erase the hurt, it was a step toward repairing our fractured relationship. As for Mia, she immediately tried to appeal the decision but quickly ran out of resources. Her reputation within the family and community had taken a massive hit. Extended family members who had initially supported her started reaching out to me, offering apologies and support. With the house and inheritance restored, I began the process of moving forward. The house, now legally mine, felt like a bittersweet victory. It represented not just my grandparents' legacy but also the struggle I'd endured to honor their wishes. Mia disappeared from the family's radar for a while. She stopped attending gatherings and avoided most of the relatives who now knew the truth. While I didn't relish her downfall, I felt a sense of relief knowing justice had been served. Reflecting on everything, I realized that this fight wasn't just about material things. It was about standing up for the values my grandparents had instilled in me: honesty, perseverance, and the importance of doing what's right. Though my relationship with Mia may never recover, I've made peace with that. Some wounds take longer to heal, or may never heal at all. For now, I'm focused on honoring my grandparents' memory and building a future they'd be proud of. Moving into my grandparents' house was bittersweet. The creaky floors, the familiar smell of lavender lingering in the garden, and the warmth of their old furniture, it all reminded me of them. But the memories also brought a sense of loss. I decided to honor their legacy by giving the house a fresh start while preserving its charm. The first thing I did was tackle some much-needed renovations. The kitchen cabinets were falling apart, and the paint on the walls had faded to a dull gray. As I cleaned and sorted through their belongings, I found treasures that brought me to tears: a box of handwritten recipes from my grandma, my grandpa's old pocket watch, and a stack of letters they'd exchanged over the years. Among them, I found a letter addressed to me. In it, they wrote about how proud they were of the person I'd become and how much they trusted me to take care of the house. They mentioned how the home had been the heart of the family for generations and hoped it would continue to be a place of love and togetherness. It was exactly what I needed to hear to push through the emotional weight of everything. One afternoon, there was an unexpected knock at the door. When I opened it, there stood Mia. She looked tired, like the last few weeks had worn her down. She asked if she could come inside, but I stood firm. After everything she'd done, I wasn't ready to let her back into my life, or my home. I told her it wasn't a good time and closed the door. She stood there for a moment before walking away, and I knew it wouldn't be the last time she tried. Grace and Robert, meanwhile, started reaching out more frequently. They wanted to talk about moving on and keeping the family together. While I appreciated their effort, I made it clear that boundaries were necessary. I wasn't going to let them sweep everything under the rug just to keep the peace. They didn't argue, but I could tell it wasn't what they wanted to hear. As I settled into the house, I reconnected with some of my extended family members. A few of them came by to apologize for believing Mia's lies. One aunt even brought over an old quilt my grandparents had made together, saying it belonged in the house. Slowly, I began to rebuild those relationships, and it felt like I was piecing together a family that had been shattered by all the drama. To celebrate the restored inheritance, I decided to host a small gathering at the house. I invited only the relatives who had shown support or reached out to mend things. It was a modest event, with homemade food and plenty of stories about my grandparents. It felt like the kind of gathering they would have loved, simple, heartfelt, and full of laughter. Mia wasn't invited, of course, but that didn't stop her from continuing to stir up trouble. She was still spreading false stories about me, trying to shift the narrative in her favor. However, her audience was shrinking. With the court ruling and the evidence against her, most people saw through her lies. Grace and Robert tried to make amends in their own way. One weekend, they offered to help with the renovations. Grace brought over some potted plants for the garden, and Robert helped me fix a leaky faucet in the bathroom. While it didn't erase the hurt, their actions felt like a genuine attempt to rebuild trust. During one of my cleaning sprees, I discovered a dusty box of photo albums tucked away in a closet. Inside were decades of family memories, pictures of birthdays, holidays, and quiet moments in the garden. I decided to create a memory room in the house, a space dedicated to preserving the legacy of my grandparents and the family history they'd cherished. The neighbors also shared stories about my grandparents. They spoke about how my grandma always baked extra cookies for the neighborhood kids, and how my grandpa had once fixed someone's fence for free after a storm. Hearing those stories deepened my appreciation for the home and the people who had lived in it. Mia's life, on the other hand, was unraveling. Her reputation had taken a massive hit, and she was facing mounting financial troubles. I heard through the grapevine that her luxury car had been repossessed due to unpaid loans. Part of me felt a twinge of sadness for her, but I couldn't ignore the choices she'd made. Despite everything, I decided to extend an olive branch. I reached out to Mia, offering her a chance to reconcile. I made it clear that while I couldn't forget what she'd done, I was willing to work toward rebuilding some sort of relationship. She refused, accusing me of holding a grudge and insisting she'd done nothing wrong. It was disappointing, but not surprising. Grace and Robert, however, seemed determined to focus on repairing their relationship with me. They started visiting more often, bringing little gifts or offering to help around the house. Their efforts didn't go unnoticed, and while it would take time to fully trust them again, it felt like a step in the right direction. As I stood in the garden one evening, surrounded by the plants my grandma had nurtured and the house my grandpa had built with love, I felt a sense of peace. I'd fought hard for this home, not just for the physical property, but for everything it represented. Justice had been served, and while the family dynamic might never fully heal, I knew I'd done right by my grandparents. This house was more than just a place to live. It was a reminder of resilience, love, and the importance of standing up for what matters. The renovations took months, but the house finally looked like the home my grandparents had always envisioned. The walls were freshly painted in soft, warm tones. The kitchen gleamed with new countertops while still holding the charm of the original layout. I even restored the garden, planting rows of lavender and roses, just like my grandma used to have. The memory room became my favorite part of the house. It was filled with photo albums, handwritten notes, and a quilt my aunt had given me. It wasn't just a room, it was a tribute to their lives and everything they had passed down to me. With the house complete, I wanted to do something meaningful with the inheritance. My grandparents had always been generous, so I started a small charity in their name. It focused on helping seniors with home repairs, inspired by the countless times my grandpa had fixed fences and mended roofs for neighbors. The project gained traction quickly, with local businesses and volunteers stepping in to help. Mia, meanwhile, left town. Word had spread about the court case, and her reputation was in tatters. From what I heard, she moved to another state to start fresh, but no one really knew for sure. The community that once admired her charm had seen her true colors, and she couldn't face the fallout. Grace and Robert started visiting more often, offering their support in small but consistent ways. Grace brought homemade meals, and Robert helped me with small repairs around the house. They expressed pride in how I'd handled everything, even admitting they'd underestimated me. Their efforts to rebuild our relationship felt genuine, and while I wasn't ready to let go of all the hurt, I appreciated their commitment. I also began building friendships with the neighbors and reconnecting with the community. People shared stories about my grandparents, each one a reminder of the kind, selfless lives they'd led. One neighbor, an elderly woman who'd known my grandma for decades, gifted me an old cookbook that had belonged to her. It was filled with notes from my grandma, and I added it to the memory room. The house became a gathering place for the family once again. I hosted a small get-together to celebrate the renovations and the charity launch. It was heartwarming to see cousins, aunts, and uncles laughing and sharing stories. Mia's absence was noticeable, but no one brought her up. It felt like a fresh start for the family, even if the wounds from the ordeal were still healing. One day I received a letter from a relative I hadn't heard from in years. They wrote about how they'd initially believed Mia's lies but had come to realize the truth. They thanked me for standing up for what was right, saying it had inspired them to reconnect with the family and reflect on their own priorities. It was a reminder of the ripple effects our actions can have, even when we don't realize it. Around this time, I started journaling about my experiences. Putting everything down on paper helped me process the whirlwind of events. It also gave me a sense of closure. I found myself reflecting not just on the pain, but also on the lessons I'd learned. Self-advocacy, resilience, and the importance of staying true to my values were recurring themes. As word of the memory room spread, extended family members began contributing heirlooms. One cousin brought over an old tea set that my grandma had gifted her as a child. Another relative sent me framed photos of family reunions from decades ago. The room became a living archive, a testament to the strength and history of our family. Mia's financial struggles became public knowledge. Her luxury car had been repossessed, and she was reportedly living paycheck to paycheck. I wasn't happy about her misfortune, but I couldn't ignore how her choices had led to this point. Despite everything, I decided to reach out one last time. I offered her a chance to reconcile, making it clear that it would require accountability on her part. She rejected the offer, blaming me for her situation and insisting she'd done nothing wrong. Grace and Robert, on the other hand, continued to show their commitment to repairing our relationship. They were consistent in their efforts, and over time, I found myself trusting them more. They never pushed for too much too soon, which made it easier to rebuild the connection. I focused on my career and hobbies, finding a renewed sense of purpose. The house became not just a home but a source of inspiration. I hosted more gatherings, welcomed neighbors for coffee in the garden, and continued expanding the charity. Years later, Mia reached out. Her tone was different, more subdued. She wanted to reconnect, but I kept my boundaries firm. I'd learned that not all relationships are worth mending, especially when trust has been broken so deeply. Looking back, I see the ordeal as a pivotal moment in my life. It was painful, exhausting, and at times overwhelming, but it taught me the value of standing up for myself and honoring the people who mattered most to me. My grandparents' love and guidance gave me the strength to face challenges I never thought I could handle. As I sit in the garden, surrounded by their lavender plants, I feel at peace. Their legacy lives on, not just in the house, but in the values they instilled in me and the relationships I've worked to rebuild. This house, this journey, is a testament to their lives and the lessons they left behind.